Hello, everyone. We are going to give all of our attendees a second to kind of pop in here, and then we will get started. All right, well, let's get going. I don't want to delay us any further because we have a lot of fun policy wonkiness to get into, which everyone in this audience loves. So I'm going to kick us off. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's briefing. As we get settled in, I hope you'll drop a note in the chat telling us where you're tuning in from. It's been fun for this briefing series to see that we've had a lot of people from really all over the country, which is exactly what we were hoping for. So feel free to weigh in with questions throughout this whole conversation, and also just chat amongst each other as well. I'm Allison Prang. I'm the Professional Development Coordinator for the National Press Club Journalism Institute in Washington, D.C. I know some of you might have already attended our first two briefings in this series with the Bipartisan Policy Center, but for those of you who are joining an event with us for the first time, I just want to give a little background on what the Institute is. The National Press Club Journalism Institute is the nonprofit arm of the National Press Club. We focus on supporting and training journalists in a number of ways through programs just like this one. And on behalf of the Institute and our colleagues at the Bipartisan Policy Center, thank you so much for joining us for this informational, important look at the big, beautiful bill that became law early last month. The Institute's mission is to power journalism in the public interest, building the skills and standards for journalists to do that work effectively and to earn the public's trust. Today's topic couldn't be more relevant to our national discourse at the moment, and we hope this briefing and the last one in this series, set to take place next week, helps journalists across the country kind of make sense of the law for their audiences. It goes without saying there's going to be some wonkiness and lots of policy jargon in any 1,000-page bill, which is why we've loved to have the staff at BPC throughout this series kind of helping us make sense of that. On that note, I want to share a bit more about the BPC, who we are delighted to produce these briefings alongside. The BPC and its advocacy affiliate, BPC Action, are unique in their approach to addressing the nation's most pressing issues. As the only organization working across the full political spectrum on domestic issues, the BPC brings together diverse perspectives to craft data-driven, pragmatic policy solutions. BPC Action then works directly with legislators and other policymakers to turn these solutions into real change. Today's briefing is specifically focused on what the new law means for family benefits and housing. It's our third of 4 briefings that we're doing as part of this series about the law. The last one, if you'd all be so kind as to mark your calendars, is next week, also on Wednesday, also at 1 p.m., and it'll be focused on what the new law means for healthcare. If you missed the first two, we had an off-the-record overview of the bill to kick us off a couple of weeks ago, and after that, we had one on tax policy, which was on the record and also recorded. Today's briefing and our one next week will also be recorded. They'll also be shared, and they're both on the record. So please drop any questions, like I said, that you have in the chat throughout, and then we'll get to them at the Q&A portion at the end. But our speakers have already informed me they'd love for this to be very Q&A centric, so please do not be shy in asking questions. For what it's worth, I think I'm also going to call this the Mizzou panel, since it appears by pure coincidence, me, Andy, and Emerson all are graduates of the University of Missouri. So MIV to you both, as well as to those in our audience. If you don't know how to respond to that cheer, I'm happy to address that during the Q&A portion at the end. And with that, it's my honor to introduce our two accomplished guests. First, we have Andy Winkler. Andy is Managing Director for Housing and Infrastructure Policy at the BPC. He helps lead the policy initiatives and staff of the Ronald Terwilliger Center for Housing Policy. He also manages BPC's Disaster Response Reform Task Force, a bipartisan group of emergency management and disaster recovery experts launched in 2020. Andy joined BPC in 2015 to staff its Executive Council on Infrastructure and Senior Health and Housing Task Force. He previously assisted Michael Stegman, formerly President Obama's top housing advisor, on housing finance reform and directed BPC's Housing Council, a bipartisan group of more than 20 housing experts and leaders that helped the center craft consensus-driven housing policy recommendations. Before joining the center, Andy was director of housing finance policy at the American Action Forum, where he also worked as a policy analyst on housing and economic issues. Born and raised in St. Louis, Andy earned a bachelor's from the University of Missouri, which I will say we love. Next, we have Emerson Sprick. Emerson is the Director of Retirement and Labor Policy at the BPC. His areas of expertise include Social Security and other social insurance programs, retirement and financial security policy, and the labor market. Emerson works closely with members of both parties and is a trusted expert for policymakers on Capitol Hill. He routinely speaks about retirement and economic policy at industry conferences, to public audiences, and with reporters, which we also love. He is regularly featured in major national media outlets, including The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, and Fortune, and has appeared on broadcasts by NPR, SiriusXM, and others. Previously, Emerson worked for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, supporting the fundraising and development efforts of the president and CEO. He earned a bachelor's in economics from the University of Missouri and a master's in economics from Georgetown University. Emerson is also a contributing researcher for the Alliance for Lifetime Income's Retirement Income Institute. I'd love to kick it over to you guys. And like I said, if you guys have audience members, please don't be shy with your questions. We'll get to them at the end. And we'd love to kind of, these guys appear to love to talk to reporters. You can't have a different opinion if you went to Mizzou, I don't think. So we're excited to do that at the end. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Allison, and ZOU, of course. So yeah, that's a really nice introduction. Really appreciate the National Press Club having Andy and me on, and really appreciate everyone who tuned in today. As the introduction suggested, my focus at BPC is primarily retirement policy. And at BPC, we have for a long time been very involved in policy focused on improving the financial lives of Americans throughout their careers and in retirement. And so today I want to share a few of the provisions that were in the One Big Beautiful Bill that relate to these topics. The kind of primary provision I want to cover is the splashiest. It's Trump accounts. I think there are typically a lot of questions about those, and there are particularly a lot of questions about Trump accounts because the code continues to be somewhat unclear in a lot of ways. The second provision I want to touch on briefly is the additional $6,000 or $12,000 deduction for seniors. And then there are a few other provisions that were included in this bill, some of which were covered by our colleagues Andrew and Shai last week, including the CTC, but I wanted to briefly touch on. So to get started, I've got a couple slides for this, and I will share those momentarily. Okay, I think I'm now sharing. So starting out with Trump accounts. Essentially, Trump accounts are IRAs for minors without earned income. IRAs, obviously an incredibly important retirement savings tool in the United States, but you have to have earned income in order to contribute to them. Trump accounts allow parents to contribute to IRAs for their children who are between birth and January 1st of the year in which they turn 18. So there are some key differences between Trump accounts and IRAs, as this slide suggests, and I'll get to those in a moment. But to quickly run through the general parameters of this policy, this is a really interesting policy because it's the first time there's ever been anything enacted in the United States that resembles child savings accounts. Child savings accounts are a big topic in the financial security space right now as industry and stakeholders think more about how to set up Americans for financial success starting as early as birth. And so this is a really interesting policy experiment that I think is going to continue to garner a lot of attention in the coming years. Another eligibility requirement for these is that beneficiaries or the children have to have a Social Security number. Contributions are subject to an annual limit of $5,000 per year. Those contributions there's no tax deduction available for those contributions. And employers can start programs to contribute to their employees or their employees' children's Trump accounts in amounts of up to $2,500 a year, which counts toward the $5,000 individual annual limit. Distributions are not allowed at all before the age of 18, and everything over and above what's called the tax basis, or what individuals put into this account through annual contributions, is taxed as ordinary income if it's taken after the age of 59 and a half. So, these accounts can be created as early as birth, but they can't be accessed without penalties until age 59 and a half. So they really are geared toward retirement more than they are kind of the traditional conception of child savings accounts, which is focused on, building skills, getting education, putting a down payment on a house, starting a business. There are some exceptions to the 10% penalty that comes with the income tax if you withdraw funds before 59 and a half for those uses. But the amounts that are allowed in those exceptions are generally pretty small. The other really important part of Trump accounts is if you are born between January 1st, 2025 and December 31st, 2028, you are eligible for a government contribution of $1,000 to your Trump account. This is not, as I think has been, I think there's been a lot of confusion about whether this is an automatic enrollment situation. It is not. Individuals have to go ahead and actively open a Trump account and opt in to this pilot program in order to get that $1,000 contribution. That could obviously play a significant financial role in someone's lives, and the question is whether that is going to reach the families who really are in need of it. I want to quickly run through the differences between IRAs and Trump accounts because they are significant, I think. There's that restriction on withdrawals. You cannot take any withdrawals before you turn 18. There's a restriction on investments. The investments in these accounts until they become IRAs on January 1st automatically of the year in which the beneficiary turns 18. Those investments must be 100% in equities, and it must be primarily United States companies. The contribution limit is lower than it is for an IRA, and there's less of a tax benefit here. There's no deduction for the contributions in. There is no Roth treatment here, so you still have to pay taxes on the way out. Everything but, like I said, the tax basis is taxed as ordinary income if you wait until 59 and a half. So there's a lot of nuance to get into with these, and I'm happy to answer questions about them, but I'll leave it at that quick overview for now. Second, I want to talk about the senior deduction real quick. This is another big provision in the OBBB. This is a fairly straightforward provision. Up to $6,000 for a single filer is available as a deduction if you are over the age of 65. This is on top of the the standard deduction, and it is only allowed for those who take the standard deduction rather than itemized deductions. And I think this chart is really interesting. It shows for a single filer, the numbers are all essentially doubled for married filers filing jointly. But it shows that the full amount of the benefit isn't really available until you hit about $24,000 in annual income. And that excludes most Social Security income for most people. So, that's particularly relevant when we think of who this is going to benefit. Not all Social Security benefits are taxed. In fact, about half of people before OBBB did not pay any taxes on Social Security benefits, and certainly no one pays taxes on 100% of Social Security benefits. So, that's an interesting component here when you think about the households and the families this is going to benefit. It will certainly benefit a big portion of the middle income and upper middle income households who are older in the United States. But as you can see through this chart, it's not going to provide a huge benefit to either particularly high earners or particularly low earners. Finally, I just wanted to touch on a few additional things. OBBB did a lot, I think, for families, or it touched a lot of policy that is focused on families. It expanded the child tax credit, which Andrew and Shai talked about last week, the CDCTC, all of these credits, which are really focused on helping families feel financially secure in having children and caring for children, and help employers provide the kinds of benefits that provide that financial security in providing care to children and other dependents. So I'll stop there. That's my very quick overview. And like I said, I'm more than happy to answer any and all questions, especially about the Trump accounts and the $6,000 senior deduction. I know there have been a lot of questions on those, but for now, I will turn it over to Andy and stop sharing my screen.
Great. Thanks, Emerson. And I want to echo Emerson's comments. I really appreciate you having BBC here. Appreciate the partnership. So like Allison said, I helped to direct BPC's J. Ronald Wilder Center for Housing Policy. We were launched a few years ago and primarily focused on finding sort of bipartisan solutions that advance the idea that every family in America should have a safe, decent, and affordable home. The reconciliation package is not a housing bill, obviously, but there are what I would say housing-specific provisions within it and housing-related provisions within it. So I will pull up a chart quickly and run through a few of the top line. Let's see here. You'll see my slides, Emerson. Nod for me. Okay.
Looks good.
So like I said, there are a handful of different provisions that certainly affect housing. For those who are sort of in the housing space, I kind of put them into provisions that affect how families afford their housing and provisions that affect supply of housing. So three I want to call out kind of more on the homeowner side or the family side of the equation. One is a mortgage interest deduction, obviously connected to housing. The OBBB continues what was already a new limit on the mortgage interest deduction, moving it down from a limit of $1 million on the price of a home to $750,000. But one addition here is that you can now, they restored what was the deductibility of mortgage insurance payments. So in addition to your mortgage interest, you can also count mortgage insurance, which is often needed if you are putting down less than 20% on your home purchase. But again, like Emerson said, some of these only apply if you are itemizing, and the bill also included a doubling of the continued doubling of the standard deduction with an increase in tying it to inflation. Emerson, correct me if I'm wrong. So fewer families will ultimately be itemizing and ultimately claiming the mortgage interest deduction, which used to be sort of a flashpoint in the housing industry, and as fewer folks claim it, has become less and less sort of controversial. One other is SALT. Obviously, property taxes and being able to deduct property taxes has a housing connect. The new limit from 10,000 to 30,000 may allow some additional, particularly in higher property tax states, to deduct that from their income taxes. And then finally, one other kind of item that I think has gotten a little bit of attention is the elimination of a handful of energy efficiency tax credits that apply to housing. These aren't overly generous, but they can, add up for a homeowner who is looking to make improvements, whether it's a new solar panels on their roof or energy efficient windows or doors, even home energy audits. Applied for some of the deductions, and most of these, at least for the homeowner side, end at the end of this year, which means there's been a few stories about a little bit of a rush for folks to try to get in those solar panel purchases or what have you before the end of the year to be able to claim these deductions. The other two that we'll see apply more to construction of homes and for builders of both single family and multifamily housing. So single family homes and apartment buildings. Those for the most part end next year as opposed to the end of this year. On the kind of housing supply side of the equation, which I think has gotten the most attention in the housing world and for us at BPC are pretty significant. One is the permanent extension of opportunity zones. A lot of opportunity zone funds have gone to finance housing. The permanent extension of the program allows for that to continue with some narrowing of the eligibility of the census tracts that are counted as opportunity zones. I think one criticism that has been leveled against them in the past has been that some of the funds steered towards communities census tracts that were slightly higher incomes adjacent to opportunity zones. So this has some provisions that are intended to get at that problem, along with different reporting requirements and other things that might help to make it a little easier for folks like me to track where opportunity zone funds are going and what they're doing. And then finally, the low-income housing tax credit. The bill significantly expanding the low-income housing tax credit through essentially just two different provisions. One is a permanent increase in what we call 9% credits. This is getting to the jargony part of what this bill does. The LIHTC program is essentially our nation's largest housing production tool. And there are two types of tax credits. One are called 9% credits and one are called 4% credits. The 9% credits have been increased, or the allocations for them have been increased by 12% permanently. This is restoring, there used to be a 12.5% increase passed a few years ago that lapsed. So it's an attempt to bring that back, as well as what we call the private activity bond financing threshold. So essentially for those 4% credits, which are a little less generous, they cover less of the project costs when you're building an affordable, so rent restricted, income restricted housing building. You have for the 4% credits, you have what are called private activity bonds, or a type of bond that you put out. The threshold required to cover the project cost is going down from 50 to 25%. That's actually the more significant of these two provisions. It's alone responsible for much more of what is projected to be an increase in affordable housing construction. There's a tax credit firm, Novogradac, who has put out an estimate of these two provisions and what they expect the impact to be. They have said it should result in 1.22 million additional affordable rental units over the next 10 years. So this has been a kind of a long-standing priority for a lot of different advocates, stakeholders in the housing community, and is actually an incredible bipartisan kind of provision within the bill. There was a standalone bill called the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act that has been reintroduced in multiple Congresses, attempting to do some very similar things with additional provisions. And so these are two kind of things plucked out of that and put into the bill that are expected to have a pretty significant impact on housing supply. And then finally, I just wanted to make one point, kind of similar to what Emerson showed at the end. There are many different kind of tax credits, tax deductions, tax exemptions that affect household budgets. And for the most part, I think folks in the housing world really focus on things that are housing specific, like the low-income housing tax credit. But these are equally important because housing affordability has two components. It's not just the price of the house and house prices, which have gotten a lot of attention, but it's also incomes. It's what an individual family can afford. So things like the doubling of the standard deduction, the child tax credit, a lot of these expenses, if they result in higher after-tax income, that has a significant impact on the ability to afford your housing. So one other point I wanted to make is that, BPC has done some polling in the past, my colleagues working on childcare and other projects, kind of looking at what people spend their tax refunds on. Not unexpectedly, the top one is on necessary expenses in life. Normally, for most families, at the very top of that list is housing. After that, maybe childcare or utilities. So housing is a significant driver of household expenses, and all of these components kind of work together. I think I would be remiss not to mention as well, the broader impact on kind of the federal budget, deficits, debt going forward. I know our colleagues almost certainly talked about that in one of the past briefings, but that has downstream impacts on housing as well. If we are spending more as a country, if we're deficit spending in larger and larger amounts, things like housing spending programs at HUD get crowded out. And in addition, if we have a higher interest rate environment going forward, that affects the ability for folks to get into first-time home ownership, to buy a house, to borrow money down the line. So just one other kind of macro impact when we're thinking about the bill and all of its implications. And I will maybe stop there and see if we have any questions. See if I can.
Yeah, great. If I'm up, you guys can hear me, I'm all back on. Would love to kind of we have a couple questions already from the audience, which is fantastic. I think we're gonna go back to you really quick, Andy, because the first one's on housing. Can you kind of delve more into the negative/positive consequences of the housing provisions? This person raised, not sure totally how this applies to regular people or how they will be affected. How could we see some of this play out, basically?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I want to put it into kind of the context. LIHTC is a program that only builds, on a good year up to 100,000 units. So we're not talking about a program that is necessarily going to solve our housing supply shortage. But it is the most significant federal program to support both the preservation of housing and the construction of new affordable rental housing. So it's important, but not going to change or solve the problem by itself. So it is an important provision, but to your point, it's not going to affect every family. Some of the changes on the individual side of the tax code actually will materially impact families. We're in a higher interest rate environment, so we have seen a slight uptick in people claiming the mortgage interest deduction. While it gets kind of a rap as being a deduction that mostly benefits higher income folks, and that is true. At the same time, average people are starting to pay pretty high housing prices when they're buying a house, and in a high interest rate environment, you're getting up to that above the standard deduction, above $15,000 in interest pretty quickly. I think that's just over a $300,000 house. In your first year as a first-time home buyer in a standard loan, you would start to pay above $15,000 in interest. So it is a program that could technically benefit, first-time home buyers and folks who are trying to buy a house. Similar thing for SALT. I think it also gets a lot of attention in higher tax states like New York, but also another program that the lifting of the cap to $40,000 does have a pretty material impact if you're in a place like DC or New York where you are paying pretty high property taxes when you couple that with the mortgage interest deduction.
Thanks. It's really helpful. So I actually want to add to this person's question a little bit. So as far as the broader issue of sort of the housing shortage that, we hear a lot about from people in Washington and more broadly, and, say you're a middle income level person trying to buy a home, it doesn't sound like these things will maybe affect that too crazy much, but maybe in kind of tangential ways from what you're saying. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's right. It wasn't intended to kind of solve all of our housing challenges, right? And it doesn't have any kind of provisions. For example, one thing people have been considering over the years is should we convert the mortgage interest deduction into a more narrowed, targeted homebuyer tax credit to help first-time home buyers get into homeownership. Nothing like that made it into the bill. So there is actually I know we're talking about one bill now, but there is a bill in the Senate Banking Committee that passed unanimously, the Road to Housing Act, just this summer. It includes a lot of more programmatic changes to housing, to HUD programs, as well as new programs to incentivize state and local governments. So, I think you need to think about more of the bill in the context of other things that Congress is doing. But also, if we're just talking about the housing crisis, housing affordability challenges, it's things that need to be done on every single level of government. And if we're being totally honest, the most levers when it comes to housing are at the local level. So much of what we do in federal policy is to get state and local governments to do things to build more housing, less so that, we're going to solve the entire problem at the federal level.
That's really helpful context. Thank you. We have another housing question. How does the new law impact the allocation for public housing subsidies? This person has Section 8 in parentheses, and family self-sufficiency program, as well as CDFI funding under the U.S. Treasury, which provides for pre-development and acquisition financing of affordable housing. Wow, that's an impressive question. Do you want to take that, Andy?
Yeah, they're deep on that one.
Yes.
So the bill doesn't do much. I think, where a lot of proposed cuts to different programs fell out. So really, the chart that I pulled up is the extent to which there were material programmatic cuts to housing programs. So nothing involved, Section 8 or the CDFI fund. But those things have been proposed in the president's budget. So that's one thing I think, because so many big things are happening at once, we can conflate them. So that is actively kind of a debate. The president put out his budget, House and Senate appropriations committees have put forward their bills in committee. Those do have some material cuts, but we're not to the finish line yet. A lot of people expect those cuts to be pared back over time. And it's still a little unclear, how that process is going to move forward when Congress comes back in September.
Gotcha. Thank you. Another homes question, which makes sense. I feel like housing is very front of mind for everyone right now. Are there shifting demographics of younger people waiting longer to buy homes and start a family? Are there impacts to aging baby boomers without retirement and savings being impacted? And then we have a third question I'll tack onto this from this person. Is there then even more focus on BTR of SF homes and foreign sovereign wealth funds and outside foreign capital filling the vacuum? If this person could add to maybe clarify what some of those acronyms are, I think that could be helpful for the audience. So maybe the first couple of facets of those you might want to tackle, Andy, and then
Sure.
build to rent. Thank you. They clarified that. Focus on build to rent. Yeah.
I think so. For just the kind of generational cohorts and what's happening in the market at the moment, I think the short answer is yes. I think a lot of people have delayed purchases of a house because of some of the factors that we've talked about. Student loans is another one that hasn't come up. But for most of the surveys that I have seen, and places like Fannie Mae do surveys pretty periodically of kind of home buyer sentiment and what people are feeling in the market, there's still the interest in buying a home. It's more so that people do not have the savings or feel like they don't have the savings to be able to afford a down payment. In addition, we just have really high housing costs over the last few years. In some places since the pandemic, we've seen prices increase for the average home of over 40, 50% in some places. So you're talking about really high costs. There are fewer homes for sale. People are looking and they're going out and they're saying, am I really going to take a 6, 7% mortgage rate for a house that I don't even really want that is overpriced? So I think there's kind of a sentiment like, nah, I'm just going to keep renting until it makes a little bit more sense for me. Similar dynamic, I think, for older Americans, they may have paid off their house or they have a really low interest rate from during the pandemic when they refinanced. And there's little to no incentive to get rid of that. If they're looking to downsize, well, they're going to end up paying that 6%, 7% mortgage when they, have already paid off their house or have a 2%, mortgage rate from just a couple of years ago. So I do think there's still kind of a pool of people who are waiting to put their home for sale just because it's looking like, the math doesn't math. It doesn't make sense for them to do it right now.
You get a smaller house, the same amount of money, it sounds like.
Maybe. Yes.
This is really helpful. I might add, while we kind of wait for more questions from the audience, I might add a couple of my own, just going off Andy. Emerson, we are not ignoring you, but just to kind of keep going on the housing track and the programs you noted. So I know some of the programs in your chart or the table you shared, that was really helpful. I know the Trump administration has already tried to kind of scale those back, maybe unilaterally, even before the big, beautiful bill was passed, like the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. And then also, obviously, there have been efforts to dismantle the CFPB. I'm curious, does the fact that now those were kind of made more official, I guess, if you will, by being passed through the law, was that kind of why that was done, I guess? Was that kind of cover for any of the previous kind of executive moves the administration made? Now they're officially enacted by Congress. Like, can the administration do more to kill those efforts?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think things like take the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, for example. I had in the chart, savings of only $138 million coming from it. That's a $27 billion program. The past administration made a pretty concerted effort to get most of the money obligated and out there. Emerson might actually want to chime in on more of the budget side of this, but a lot of the cuts that had been talked about, propose pauses in spending, are working their way through the courts. Some were proposed in a rescissions package that, there's some interest in some of them and some not some interest in others. When we look at the House and Senate appropriations bills that I talked about in the budget process, they largely ignored a lot of the recommended cuts to housing programs. I think there's an awareness and understanding among both parties in Congress that housing is such a key issue, even politically, to start to cut some of those programs that help lower income folks afford housing. Just isn't tenable. There's a lot of interest in actually growing them, quite the opposite of what's been proposed. So I think you have to take everything with a little bit of a grain of salt. The president's budget is, a glorified wish list. It's what he wants to do. It's not any indication that that's what Congress is going to do.
We have another question from the audience, also on housing. Much of the housing ecosystem has been impacted by insurance premiums after disasters. What is being done to address this, especially in California and Florida? Yeah, does the new law do anything to kind of tackle that, or is Congress even considering anything now on that front you could talk about?
Yeah, that's a great question. So actually, BBC has and maybe we can share it in the chat. We did a report on rising property insurance costs back in February. There is a ton of interest in Congress in doing something, but insurance is generally regulated, or it is regulated at the state level. There are only so many avenues for federal policymakers to get involved. Some have wanted to propose sort of a new backstop for insurance programs. Others want to kind of double down on incentives for homeowners, property owners to make resilience upgrades to reduce the risks that they have related to insurance. But it's complicated because every single state is different. Some of the challenges they face are different, and the solutions they face are different. So I think federal policymakers are still sort of grappling with what they can do. And our report was an attempt to say, there is a lot of interest in this area and there are some bipartisan ideas. Even if they do not completely solve the problem in and of themselves, the federal government has a role to play too.
Wonderful. I have a couple of my own questions while we wait for some more from the audience. I want to go to Emerson, the Trump accounts you were very excited to talk about. I'm curious, and you could raise some interesting details with those, that you have to opt in. You can't, this doesn't just kind of magically happen for you if you have, a kid in that range. Are there any key deadlines that reporters should be aware of that are coming up, like related to those accounts or when they have to take action by? I'm curious.
It's an interesting question, and I think a lot is still up in the air here. So they're built on the IRA infrastructure, but it's a completely new kind of account, and so they're not offered yet. So the law called for the Treasury Department to choose initial trustees, essentially the financial companies that are going to house these accounts at the beginning, set those up by 1 year from passage of the bill. So that'd be July 4th, 2026. These need to be set up and ready for folks to open accounts and opt in. A couple quirks here are, there's one thing that is going to make this, I think, so that's a very ambitious timeline for the financial industry to create a new savings vehicle. And so it's going to be really interesting to see how that timeline actually works out. One thing that adds to the complexity is that IRAs currently take one of two forms, a traditional IRA or a Roth IRA. In a traditional IRA, your contributions are not taxed on the way in. Everything is taxed as income on the way out. In a Roth IRA, you pay taxes on everything when you receive it as income. You put it in an IRA, and then you don't pay any income taxes on it when it comes out. This combines those two, kind of. There are no deductions for what you put in. And then when you take withdrawals after age 59 and a half, only the withdrawals that represent, what's over and above the basis or what you put in is taxed, which means that the financial institutions need to find a way to what's called track the basis. That is a completely new aspect of IRAs that the financial industry is going to have to figure out how to build into this. The second kind of quirk here is that all Trump accounts are going to have to be created through Treasury and through these initial trustees. And then individuals are going to be allowed to roll them over into their preferred financial institution if their financial institution offers the infrastructure for Trump accounts. So seeing how that plays out is also going to be a really interesting part of this. But to really directly answer your question, that the deadline is on the government to get these trustees set up by July 4th, 2026. And then it's going to be on individuals after that.
Gotcha. No, that's fascinating. That's really helpful. And will that be a formal regulatory process where I guess, you're proposing a new rule, kind of like, if you will, and then industry can weigh in about, we don't like how that works, this needs to work this way to kind of work more seamlessly, or what can we expect there?
Yeah, so there are two things going on in the Treasury Department right now. One is, I believe they've already released an RFP or a request for proposals from the financial industry to determine who is going to be that initial trustees or that cohort of initial trustees. It might be one financial institution, it might be multiple. The second thing that's going on, and I know from conversations I've had that the Treasury Department is really focusing on this, is making this one of their top priorities, is that regulatory process you were talking about in figuring out some of the uncertainty around the structure and the legality of these vehicles that many stakeholders feel was not made completely clear in the law itself. And so that is going to be a really significant regulatory effort here for Treasury to provide that guidance, not only to the financial industry and the trustees, but also to individuals, taxpayers looking to use these accounts. And that's going to be a big effort, but one that they are certainly going to solicit comments from the public on.
Gotcha. And then I have one more question on that before we hop to a good audience one that's back on housing. So you mentioned that the Trump accounts will have to primarily be invested in U.S. companies. Is that some of kind of the guidance we're waiting for more detail on, that maybe people, I assume there's not some list of companies that was published, but these are primarily, U.S. companies. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, the investment parameters for Trump accounts are really interesting. As far as I know, there are no other types of accounts in the Internal Revenue Code that require investments to be 100% in equities. In some ways, it makes sense for these accounts in folks, first 18 years of life to be in 100% equities, but it certainly raised some eyebrows that was mandated in the law. And the second part, as you mentioned, is that those investments have to be primarily in U.S. equities. And so, what primarily means is going to be up for kind of regulatory interpretation. My guess is that the Treasury Department is not going to issue guidance that says primarily U.S. investments means the portfolio has to be 75% in U.S. companies. That would be very hard to enforce and administer as different investments grow and lose value in different ways. Instead, if this becomes an issue, it will be through litigation, where a financial institution has. I don't know what the scenario is going to be, but I imagine it would be through litigation and not through proactive regulatory clarity. It's the same with fees. There's a very specific fee threshold in this code, in this bill for Trump accounts. Account fees can be no more than, I think, 10 basis points or 0.1% of the account, the asset value. But in general, for accounts like this, regulations and laws say fees must be reasonable. And what reasonable looks like is determined through litigation rather than specific regulation.
That's interesting. So that could come to shove there too, it sounds like. We have another, I'm going to go back to Andy really quick for another housing question. Andy talked about the affordable housing side and homebuyer side of policies, but is there any component of the bill that encourages more missing middle, that's in quotes, housing inventory? Covering local government here, they're doing their best to locally spur that creation, but their incentives to developers are pretty limited. That's a great question, I feel like, given what we left off on with you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say the One Big Beautiful Bill does not directly have any provisions targeting missing middle housing. There's a number of, I mentioned some of the things like opportunity zones. I didn't talk about new markets tax credit, but there are other kind of tools that help sort of the business side of the equation or investors provide some slight incentives there, but not specifically focused on missing middle housing. I will say the Senate banking bill that I mentioned, Road to Housing, which was pushed by Tim Scott and Elizabeth Warren, does include a ton of different provisions, including a lot of programs that are targeting or encouraging state and local zoning changes, which would be kind of targeted towards missing middle housing. Things like allowing by right development of duplexes or triplexes or slightly denser housing, things like that are included in some of the provisions. One, for example, is tying, we call it the Community Development Block Grant Program. It's a long-standing program at HUD. It hasn't been updated in a really long time, but there's a proposal in the bill, for example, to encourage recipients of those funds, which are generally major metro areas or states, administer the funds for more rural areas. You can be penalized if you don't meet housing production goals by withholding or reducing some of those funds vis-a-vis other grantees. So you're kind of gauged against everybody else. And if you're at the bottom of the chain, you're not meeting kind of your targets, you lose out on some federal funding. So that's a step, I think, in sort of the right direction, where it's encouraging some of those changes at the local level that would allow denser types of housing to be developed.
For that bill, I'll just follow up on that answer, Andy. For the bill, it sounds like it has some bipartisan support with Scott and Warren both backing it. Would you expect that to see maybe attached to a larger piece of legislation like the budget or something else instead of passing on its own? What's the future of that maybe look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a little unclear what the legislative vehicle will be, but I am encouraged because it was voted unanimously out of the Senate Banking Committee, which if we're talking about pieces of legislation these days, that's relatively rare. The committee actually did a really great job. They pulled together dozens of bipartisan housing bills, put them into a package, negotiated it, and passed it out of committee with unanimous support. So, I think that strong support coming out of committee helps make the case that they should get a vote on the Senate floor. As a standalone bill, or to your point, it needs to attach to some other legislative vehicle. I think a lot of folks in the housing community will now start to lobby the House side to do something either very similar or to take up whatever the Senate passes.
That's really interesting. Is the thinking there that zoning is the way that I guess zoning works in a lot of places is that it's currently kind of working against having a larger supply of housing? Or I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot. Is this, it's not the one big beautiful bill, but I'm just curious if you can speak to that at all.
Yeah, absolutely. There are all kinds of different requirements at the state and local level, from how many parking spaces you need for a new building to how high it should be, how set back it should be, how big the lot should be. There's all types of different kind of state and local zoning land use requirements that collectively restrict the development of new housing or add to the cost of it. So just navigating all of those processes, making sure you're meeting those requirements costs money. And for a larger development ends up adding additional costs to the project. So that is a huge barrier to the development of new housing. In some places, it's essentially illegal or impossible to build more than a single family home on a large lot. And so if we're thinking about kind of the shortage of homes that we have in this country, you don't get to solving it without addressing some of those barriers at the local level.
A couple more questions here I'd love to get to. Let's see. What opportunities exist for alignment with affordable housing and healthcare, given disruptions on both sides of the equation? And I think, let's see, are there changes under the One Big Beautiful Bill or Congress's budget and appropriations process? I'm kind of teasing this out a little. Maybe we start with that, and then it's a long question, so we'll start with that, then we can kind of add anything from the question based off what your answer is, Sandy.
Yeah, so there's a handful of areas where I think the point is really well made that housing for a lot of folks is health. It's a place, particularly for older adults, where they spend most of their time, and the home is often a site of care. If we're talking about telehealth or anything like that, it's providing that healthcare in the home. So there's tons of different ways in which housing is connected to healthcare. Some that we don't always think about, from asthma triggers and mold and lead and paint. So there's kind of health hazards. There's, like I said, site of care. There's homelessness, which is deeply connected to everything from mental and behavioral health to just access to healthcare. So there's tons of connectivity between, these programs at the federal level. There needs to be more. BPC actually had you mentioned in my bio, we worked on a senior health and housing task force that was completely dedicated to how, we could better integrate housing and healthcare in the service of helping older adults. We did a report a few years ago too on how HUD and HHS can be better partners together in connecting their programs, from everything from data to, like I said, lead and asthma triggers to substance abuse. So I think there's tons of ways. When we're talking about current programs, I'm not a Medicaid expert, so I don't want to weigh too deeply into all of the changes. I haven't stayed on top of it. But there has been a growing kind of interest in certain states in getting, particularly Medicaid, to pay for or help support housing stability for highest risk patients. There's people who come out of the hospital and they don't have a place to stay, so they ultimately end up right back in the emergency department. So there are like savings that can be realized if we better integrate those systems.
Yeah, and I'll second what Martina from BBC put in the chat. We will have more on all things Medicaid and healthcare changes. Yes.
Yeah, I defer to my colleagues.
Very fair. Emerson, we have one for you on the Trump accounts. To kind of talking about that. What's the source of funding for the Trump account, $1,000 gifts for parents who sign up by the end of 2028? And then someone also asked, can parents sign up for an account but not add funding to it?
Yeah.
Maybe address, we'll do the first one and second one, yeah.
Sure, great questions. No funding source was articulated in the bill, which means this is going to come from general revenues, which is a fancy way of saying that it's an additional $12 or $13 billion of borrowing over the next 10 years, but mainly over the next 4 years. The Trump account pilot program, those $1,000 contributions, like I said, and like this question alludes to, are only available between, for the 4 years, 2025 to 2028. And so the vast majority of the cost of the broader Trump account provision, which is $12 or $13 billion, comes in these next 4 years. One thing I will mention is just as a point of clarification is that that pilot program relates to the dates of that pilot program relate to the birth date of children. So it's for children who are born between January 1, 2025 and December 31st, 2028. And then, what the exact claiming process looked like is explicitly left up to the Department of Treasury in the code. So we are awaiting regulatory clarity and will be awaiting regulatory clarity for many months on what exactly that is going to look like. It could be that the act of opening a Trump account for a child who is eligible is seen as claiming the $1,000 pilot program contribution. It could be that those are two separate steps, that a parent of an eligible child will have to both open the Trump account and then claim the pilot program funds. Like I said, that's just not yet clear, and will be made more clear in the coming months as the Department of Treasury works out their final guidance on the policy.
Gotcha. And so then if a parent wanted, I mean, hypothetically, could you just keep that $1,000 in there and let it invest that, or do you have to add your own money on top of that over time?
No, the $1,000 pilot program contributions are no strings attached. So, for parents of eligible children, that aspect of Trump accounts is an absolute no-brainer. I think if you have a child who is eligible for the $1,000 contribution, you should probably go ahead and claim it, because it's $1,000 of free money for your child when he or she turns 59 and a half. But it will have 59 and a half years to accrue returns. And there are, as I said, those exceptions to the 10% penalty for early withdrawals related to, education, credentialing, home ownership, things like that.
Okay, that's really helpful. I know there are a couple more questions. We are at time. The good news is you will be able, Emerson, Andy, other experts from the BPC regularly talk to the press. My colleague is going to drop their contact info for their press contacts in the chat. So feel free to reach out to them with any follow-up questions, wanting to circle back on anything, what have you. And this will also be recorded. So if you do need to go grab a link from the chat you missed grabbing before, or want to re-listen to any of their answers, feel free to do that, everyone in the audience. So thank you so much again, Andy and Emerson. You packed so much information into our time together on some very complicated topics that it sounds like we're still waiting for more news on. So keep your ears and eyes peeled, everyone. And thank you to our audience for their awesome questions. This was fantastic. Like I said, we have info in the chat about how to get in touch with both of them. And to everyone in the audience, we hope you'll join us next week at the same time for our last briefing in this series about what this bill, now law, means for the healthcare sector. We'll drop a link in the chat also about how you can register for that now. I'll just reiterate kind of for our story, the Institute is really proud to produce briefings and training at no cost to journalists across the US with the mission of powering strong journalism in the public interest. If you'd like to support us in this work, we hope you'll consider making a donation. A lot of our programming, like this exact program, is free. And we just thank you all again for being here. Stay well, and we hope to see you again soon. And we'll let you guys kind of grab those links if you need to for a sec. So we'll just kind of hang here for a minute. Thanks, everyone. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Allison.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.